Another important question that I'm sure is on the mind of everyone here, especially when we hear about the anticipated IMF loan, which is expecting to pave the way for additional loans from other multilateral and regional partners. So the question that comes to mind is, how should the size of Egypt's foreign debt be perceived? Is it alarming yet? And how can this cycle of dependency on loans be reversed? Those are the questions that we will seek to answer in our next session. And I would like to invite on stage our very own chair of the Department of Economics at the AUC School of Business, Dr. Dina Abdel Fattah. Dr. Abdel Fattah is an assistant professor of economics. She specializes in gender economics, labor migration, and refugee integration. She is graduated from the AEC School of Business before pursuing her master's and PhD from the University of Sussex. She'll be also moderating this session. I also invite on stage Dr. Ali Al-Mahdi, another esteemed economist and published writer, and professor of economics at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University. Dr. Al-Mahdi is engaged for over 40 years in different areas of education, social protection, fiscal, monetary, and trade policies, FDI, industrial policies, labor market studies, as well as micro and small enterprise dynamics. I would also welcome on stage Dr. Ahmed Galal, economist and chairman of the board of the MENA Health Policy Forum. Dr. Galal has extensive experience in economic policy advice. He was director of the Economic Research Forum for 10 years and was Egypt's finance minister between July 2013 and March 2014. Next, I'm happy to welcome Mr. Ahmed Koshuk, Vice Minister of Finance for Fiscal Policies and Institutional Reform at the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Koshuk is an economist and policy advisor with more than 18 years of experience across various units at the ministry: the macro-fiscal unit, debt management, public-private partnership, transparency and citizen engagement, public financial management, and institutional reform units. He also sits on the boards of several institutions, including the Arab Investment Bank. Welcome to the session.
Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm actually very happy to be moderating this session and sitting next to a group of the greatest economists in Egypt and discussing a topic that is not only of significance to economists, but actually to all Egyptians who follow the news on the TV or on social media. They would love to understand more about the situation of Egypt's external debt. The size of Egypt's external debt continues to have an upward trend, when a few years ago, the debt to GDP ratio was considered more sustainable. As Egypt is getting closer to realizing the new IMF extended facility fund of $3 billion that aims at safeguarding macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability, and strengthening the social safety net and stepping up reforms. This new loan is expected to pave the way for additional loans from regional and multilateral partners. So the question now is, how should the size of Egypt's external debt be perceived? And how can this cycle of dependency on borrowing be reversed? So I would actually like to welcome all the panelists for this session. And I would actually like to start with Mr. Ahmed Koshuk and ask you, while analyzing the size of Egypt's external debt, what do you say are the main factors that should be considered?
Thank you, Dina, for the invitation. And I don't know if you have always had this slide or not, but I feel a bit different this time. But thank you for the invitation and for also inviting me to speak with also my professors and my mentors for a very important topic. I will try to, in my first intervention, to a bit put facts, because here we are discussing something very important that we are all want to make sure that it's under control, that is well managed, and that is benefiting the economy. But let's put things into perspective. Our external debt is around $155 billion. This is total Egypt external debt. Almost 55% of it, around 82 billion, is the government debt. Not the government, it's the what we call the budget sector debt. It's the debt that is managed by the Ministry of Finance, including the IMF borrowing, including the World Bank borrowing, and the rest of that. The rest of this debt is either debt on the central bank. When we hear deposits coming from the Gulf held at the central bank, it's part of their debt. And we have around 12% of the debt is also banks, commercial banks, public banks that borrow. So this is the structure of our debt. This debt have increased significantly, especially across all categories, but it has increased significantly across also, or at entities across the outside the government. So it's not only the government. The government debt may be doubled, but for other categories it tripled and more. This is important because people have in mind only the 82 billion, and they sometimes don't know that the composition includes a lot of other players. So this is fact number one. The second fact is that our external debt, when you look at its currency composition, it has a nice mix. Of course, the dollar is almost 50%, but you have also what we call the SDR, which is the currency used by the IMF, which is a mix of currencies, represent also a decent share of our debt, as well as the euro. So there is a nice mix. And the third thing that I want to say about facts is that around 65% of our debt is with a fixed rate. So we're not, we are de-risking a bit ourselves from the refinancing that might happen now, or from the current tightening that's taking place. So around 65 to 70% of our debt is that. The average maturity of our debt, external debt, the entire 155, is around 9 years. That's on average, the average debt, the average maturity of our external debt. It's higher, of course, than our domestic debt, which is around 2 years. So those are the facts. You said something very important. You asked a question about how we measure our debt, what are the factors that affect our debt and our capacity to be in external debt. I think there are three key measures and matrices that are used internationally. The first one is our external debt as a percent of our GDP. How much our debt in terms as a relative size to our entire economy. And now our external debt is around 34% of GDP. It's not 30% and below is very, very safe. From 30 to 40 is a very moderate or low risk. From 40 to 50 is high risk, and above 50 is very high risk. So this is not the most alarming indicator that we have. We have other alarming indicators. So our external debt in terms of the size is not the most alarming. What is more alarming is the debt service as a percent, which is a very important indicator, how much you service your debt, as a percent of our also annual, or the key contributor to our foreign currency, which is exports of goods and services. Here is where our external debt is not or is recording alarming levels. Usually, anything between 20 to 30% of debt service as a percent of export proceeds is something we think safe and good. Anything above that, then your debt service as a percent of your export base, or the main generator of your forex currency, is a bit alarming. We are at about 40% and 40+%. So this is where I think the alarming part of the debt. I will stop here now, but this is a very basic numbers, and maybe we talk more later about more details there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. And you actually took us from looking at the debt not only from an overall size perspective or the debt to GDP ratio, but we now also are looking at the size of the service of the debt in terms of its exports. So this would take me to Dr. Alia and actually ask you, how would the size of the external debt affect Egypt's international reserves, value of currency, the fiscal space? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, and I'd like to thank Business Forward for inviting me. Well, let me say this at the beginning. Egypt has been a borrowing country since a very long time, since the mid-70s. And but there were times where the debt was growing at a high rate. For instance, the time since 1975 until 1983, the debt was escalating in one of the years, growing by 118%. And then came the mid-80s till the 90s, where there was a very clear decline in debt, a negative growth rate of debt. And then again, in 2007 alone, the debt grew. And then finally, from 2015 until today. Why are we in a very chronic situation to be indebted? Yeah. What is the problem with the Egyptian case? The Egyptian economy is not structurally advanced or competitive. When you look at our savings rate, it's extremely low. Even when we take into consideration the workers' remittances, it does not exceed at the best time 20% of GDP. When you look at our investment rate, it's also very modest, does not on the average exceed 16 to 17% of GDP. You cannot be growing at these rates, really. Egypt cannot be growing with an investment rate at 16% or 17%. Countries that do grow manage to have much more higher investment rates, like 35%. So we've been in a very modest and shallow position ever since the 70s or 80s, up until today. Added to that, the external, the trade balance has been always negative, despite what the trade agreements that we have with different partners. All our positions are negative with the different partners. We have no agreement partner with which we have a positive trade balance. So we do have a problem. So that the government is all the time trying to make it up for the low investment rate, low savings rate by borrowing. The problem is when we look at the indicators of the debt, I try to look at the different indicators that are listed in the international organizations. Egypt is not one of the worst countries. I mean, if you look at debt to GDP, external debt to GDP, it's not more than 35%. There are countries where the external debt to GDP is much more higher than that. If you look at debt service to GDP, if you look at the different indicators of debt, they are high, but they are not the highest. However, where is the problem? The problem is that during the last 6-7 years, all these indicators were growing at a fast rate. And this is crucial, and this is alarming, because they were all growing, posing a pressure on our economy, meaning they are posing a pressure on our budget. They are posing a pressure on our resources that are coming from abroad, foreign resources. They make a high percentage, for instance, of our international financial international reserves. So we are talking about now the debt service amounts to 71% of our international the external debt amounts to 71% of our international reserves. The other problem is that when you look at the short-term versus the long-term debts, short-term debts in 2013 represented 7% of the total external debt. Now we are talking about 17% or more. So now, what does it mean? Why is it alarming? Because once you are talking about a short-term debt, it means you have to repay it quickly. So it means that the burden is higher, stronger. So there are different indicators. They are not the worst, but they are alarming in their trend. And this is what we have to take care of. The external debt affects the fiscal space, definitely, because we have to repay the debt. And the problem is that some of the debts were giving us a grace period. Now the grace period is over, and we have to start paying. I mean, let's have a look at what we used to pay 5 years ago. We used to pay like $7 billion a year. This year, until now, we paid $26 billion in repayment of debts and so on. So the trend, the future is alarming. That's why we have to look into that and think of what we can do to overcome this issue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alia. This is adding another layer to the discussion of the external debt. And what we have so far is that we are not at a situation that is very bad, but we are at a situation that is alarming, and we need to be very careful when or how we proceed with our policies with that. Dr. Ahmed Galal, I would actually ask you, can we highlight any positives out of this borrowing? So Egypt has been borrowing. Can we highlight any positives out of this borrowing? Could the economy be at a better place with this borrowing?
These guys specialize in the bad news. And Dina decided that I am the one who's going to carry the good news. Can you put down the lights a little bit? I feel like we are acting on a stage. And I hardly can see you, but you can see us very well. Oh, that's really nice. That was wishful thinking on my part, but it turned out to bear some fruits. Now, what are the good news? I don't know actually whether I have plain good news, but let me and I'm not going to talk about the numbers because Ahmed has everything in his pocket, and I think Alia has given you a very good analysis. So let me give you my take on this whole issue of the public debt problem. The bottom line is that, like Alia, I am beginning to worry about it. But let's start somewhere else. Everything has roots. A problem has roots somewhere, and the roots are exactly what Alia has said. We have the saving investment gap. As Egyptians, low levels of income, therefore our saving is low, private saving is low, and the government is not saving. The government, in fact, is dissaving. The government, in fact, because of the budget deficit, is getting the money from the banking sector. So we have saving investment gap, a government gap, revenues less expenses are negative, and then you have a balance of pay or current account gap. I don't really know how can you even think that you can survive without borrowing. Borrowing is not a bad thing, by the way. Borrowing is good if you use the money that you get wisely and well. If you get the economy to be growing, if you get the infrastructure in place, if you open new markets, essentially, borrowing is not bad in its own right because you do have gaps and you want to develop. So that is the first part of the story. Now you begin to borrow. There is the easy part of the borrowing, where people tell you, go and work on the public debt management. I mean, improve the way you manage your debt. But that's really something technical, narrow, needs to be done, but it's not going to be what will make it. What would really make it is that you address the real reasons why you have these gaps. For instance, let me give you an example. If you borrow a lot of money in, let's say, in dollars or whatever it is, foreign currency, and then you put it into a power plant, the fact of the matter is the power plant sells electricity to Egyptians in local currency. Fundamentally, there is a mismatch already. There is a mismatch between the currency in which you borrowed and the currency that you collect. And therefore, you are already, by choosing to get that, put your money, the money you're borrowing, into an activity that's not going to generate foreign exchange, you are already putting pressure on yourself. That's one example. Let me give you another example. If you borrow money and then you go and, let's say, build roads. Building roads is a wonderful thing, because countries' economies don't grow very fast when you don't have good functioning roads. However, roads also, well, one, they don't generate a lot of revenue if they do. And if they do, it's in local currency, the tolls that you pay if you're going to Sokhna or to Alexandria or something. But more importantly, there is a mismatch in timing, meaning you borrow today a lot of money, and then the returns on that money are going to be much, much, much later. Therefore, you're actually creating a problem for yourself. So debt management is not necessarily the narrow perspective of looking at, how do you try to change the short term to long term, how do you get a grace period, how do you try to lower the interest rate that you are paying. These are all valid and important, but managing debt broadly, you need to work either on the roots, meaning increase savings relative to investment, reduce budget deficit, increase exports so that you have some revenues to finance your imports and the rest of the economy. Other than that, when you get the money, please don't put it in the wrong place. Worry a little bit about who is going to pay it and when. If you don't do that, I think things are going to get worse and worse and worse. So I'm sorry I don't have good news. The good news is that we need to borrow, and that's not too bad. In fact, if you want to develop, we cannot do it without borrowing. Borrowing or FDI or whatever, but at the end of the day, in smart management of the resources that you get and smart management to reduce the three gaps that I talked about are absolutely necessary. We can get into this afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. And actually, Dr. Ahmed was saying that we need to borrow, but we need to think of how to wisely use this money that is borrowed. And Dr. Alia was speaking about the structure of the economy and how we're dealing, or how structurally are we ready for this amount of borrowing. So if I may go to Mr. Ahmed Kushuk and ask you, now many people are saying that the main reason for this accelerating debt, regardless of its structure or its composition, is the continuous inability to act and provide the environment that would encourage domestic investment and FDI. And the question is, have necessary changes already started?
This question has two very important parts to address it wisely. Or accurately, let me say it more. The only way, as Dr. Ahmed have just mentioned now, the only way if you want to bring down the debt, simple. I mean, you don't need to say difficult things. You have a debt and you have a GDP, and you divide this by that. If this is being reduced over time, it means that you are lessening that. Your ability to generate income throughout the year is much higher than the size of the debt. So your question is, you're asking a very important question, how we can make sure that, because by the way, no single country in the whole world doesn't have debt. And all countries, probably even their nominal debt is increasing. And that's not the question. I'm not, with very few exceptions, and also exceptions in certain periods of time. So it's, and that's something very important that we need all when we teach students, when we talk about that, it's very important to talk about that it's very important how to measure that and how to measure the size of the debt. So the only way to reduce the debt significantly and sustainably is to have a growing economy. And for this to happen, you need the private sector to lead. You need the private sector to be in the driving seat, and you need the government to be creating the enabling environment. Part of the enabling environment is a good infrastructure. Part of the enabling environment is to spend very efficiently on infrastructure. By the way, not all the infrastructure the government can do, also the private sector can do a lot of the infrastructure spending. So I think the most important thing related to your question is how to make sure that our focus is more on making sure that the economy is growing faster than the debt growth, and that the government is playing its role in enabling the environment there. Coming also to your question, another part of it, we have been heavily investing over the last 5-6 years in a lot of sectors. We have very good assets. And we have assets not only good in nature, but also now even the operating environment that these assets have been established, have been improved in terms of pricing, in terms of the ability of having the private sector running those assets and making efficient outcome out of those assets. So I think one part of what we should be doing is not only to make sure that we are enabling the environment for the private sector, but also to make use of part of our assets, to divestiture out of it. But maybe what we should also do is to make sure that this money goes directly to reduce the debt, or to reduce or to improve the debt structure, or improve the debt service. And this is also another very important thing that we can do, that can enable things and can improve things in a way without any destabilization or any slowdown in the economy. My final comment regarding to your question in general, what the government can do else is a lot can be done. And one of the things that I keep talking about recently is, and I think it is the engine, it is the starting point, and it's something very crucial. It's not only a document, it is the state ownership policy. It's not a document, it's a policy, it's a framework, it's a mindset that is very important, because this document, which I'm very happy that also Maha in the previous session was talking about how discussion around it happened. It's a document that will say to the private sector over the next 4 or 5 years, those are the areas that you should be going without the government intervention, without the government competition, without the government playing in the same field, and those are the areas where the government will still be there for the next 5 years. And associated with it, a lot of things, competitive neutrality, making sure that even if the government and the private sector is operating, that there is a sort of framework that can allow competition and that can benefit at the end of the day the consumer. So I think one thing that the government can do as a regulator and as an enabler is to continue doing proper infrastructure spending, to divestiture a bit, and to use this outcome to reduce the debt or to improve the structure of the debt. And the third part is definitely to put the right framework and clarity and predictability for the private sector to lead, so that at the end of the day, if our GDP grew by 15-20% nominal terms and our debt grew by 10% consistently over the next 5-6 years, then suddenly your debt will be at 50-60%. The nominal value will be still higher, but the debt capacity and your level of debt compared to your income and your economy will be much lower.
Thank you very much. And actually, I would take that and go to Dr. Alia and ask her, in your opinion, what policies are needed with this coming up loan that we're expecting to arrive very soon? How can we put it to the best use? And how can we break this cycle of dependence on loans?
Thank you very much. How can we breathe? Yeah. Well, I agree with what Dr. Ahmed said in his last intervention, that the GDP has to grow. And it has to grow at a very high rate, to the extent that it would reduce the percentage of debt to GDP. But I'm talking about the real GDP, not the nominal GDP. This is number one. Number two, this cannot be done without a very strong role of the private sector. Now, the question is the infrastructure alone sufficient to induce or encourage the private sector? The answer, from my opinion, is no. Infrastructure is one condition, but it's not the whole conditions. First of all, the private sector has to be to have access to the financial market, to have access to banking. Until now, the share of the private sector is quite limited. It does not exceed 30% of the credit credit facilities granted to the Egyptian institutions or institutions altogether. The rest goes to the government. So the private sector has to have access to the financial sector. There are a lot of regulations that hamper the private sector from working. Let me be very precise. I acted as a chairman of the Iron and Steel Association. As a chairman of the association, we had so many problems to deal with, and they were all regulatory problems, no more than that. Let me give you an example. For instance, the price of electricity. The sector of iron and steel used to pay twice or three times the price of electricity a wholesale producer in Europe pays for fuel. For electricity, yes. This is one. Another issue is the high interest rates. They were extremely high interest rates in Egypt. Real interest rates at that time before today were really extremely higher than anywhere else in the world. Number three, a lot of small other regulatory measures that we were complaining of. Like, for instance, let me give you an example. The example of any company that is situated by the Suez Canal zone and was importing raw materials. A ship had to go through Suez Canal zone and pay all the fees and so on. So this makes a company in this area, which should have been very attractive, makes it not attractive at all as compared to a company that is situated in Alexandria or Damietta or any other place, because they have to pay extra money for the coming into Suez Canal and then extra money for exporting. So the price of ton would have increased by $20, $30, which makes it not competitive at all in the international markets. So there are small issues we cannot talk about, but the producers can talk about. Those, I mean, if you are really serious about helping the private sector, then we should sit with the private sector. They know their problems. They know more than all of us do about the issues that makes them not able to export more. I mean, during the last year, 2021, when the prices of natural gas and so on went down, the sector became competitive and they started to export at a very good rate. I mean, once the whole setup is improved, the whole production environment is improved, we can do much more better than we are doing right now. So the issue here is the government has to sit with the private sector, discuss the different issues, take measures quickly. I mean quickly, like today, tomorrow, not more than that, because we don't have time to lose. And second, we have to look also at the debt the volume of the debt, the value of the debt, it's high. And it's growing at a rate higher than 12% or 13% a year, which is relatively high. So we have to have a plan how to reduce the growth rate of the debt. I agree with Dr. Ahmed. We can be borrowing, but at a decreasing growth rate, not at an escalating growth rate. So I believe that the government has to sit and to look into the structure of debt and how it can reduce it. By the way, no one will help Egypt except Egypt. No international organization will give you the remedy to your problems. You have to be, we are more aware of our problems than anyone else. So we have to act upon it. We have to reduce our debt, work on reducing the growth rate of debt. I'm not saying stop being indebted, but reduce the growth rate of debt. We have to do that, or else we are in a problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alia. And actually, so far we've been looking at Egypt on the borrowing side. But now the geopolitical scene is changing, and we have recession in a number of advanced economies with an energy crisis that is expected to change the whole multilateral scene. So, Dr. Ahmed, what can we expect in the near future regarding the expected trends and directions taken by international lenders?
Now she is getting me to worry about the other guys, the lenders, the guys who are not here. I am worried about the borrowers. I'll continue to worry about the borrowers. Let me just say a couple of words about the answers that you have gotten, because I think it's a very serious question. The question is, how do you break the cycle of borrowing and over-borrowing and getting stuck once in a while? You have easy solutions that are not very good, and you have more difficult solutions which are absolutely necessary. I will say a few words at the end toward the international environment. The easy ways out is that you get a war in the Gulf and you get a debt forgiveness of 50% of your debt. So if you want to solve your problem, start a war somewhere. That's one easy solution, but unfortunately, you know, that is not within our hands. Alia says, Rabbina Qadir. That doesn't work. The other one that also doesn't work is that you just rely on growing your denominator, like my good friend here, Ahmed, said. Borrow, borrow, borrow at the top, but then your denominator is going to grow faster and you're going to be fine. I'm sorry, that's not a good idea. Why? I mean, of course, fundamentally it's correct. You need to grow faster. That is true. But borrowing without worrying about what you are borrowing, for what you are borrowing, how you are going to repay it, all that is equally important. So I cannot basically satisfy myself by saying I'm going to grow out of the problem. Just wait for me, and one of these days we are all going to live happily ever after. That's not going to happen. Now, we come to the real solutions, which I already indicated. You have to worry about your current account, therefore it's exports. I remember 15 years ago writing an article in Arabic, the title of which معضلة الصادرات المصرية, the dilemma of the Egyptian exports. And the dilemma was, somebody said at the time, either we export more or die. The trouble is, time went by, we didn't increase exports, and we didn't die. So I asked myself the question, and I tried to answer it at the time, and basically the answer is a very simple one. In the previous session, there was an indication that Egyptian business people like to sell domestically rather than compete with the guys outside. That's complete nonsense. I'm sorry. Business people in Egypt, as elsewhere, are very rational, intelligent people. They go where they make more money. If the policies provided by the government make it attractive for them to sell domestically, they will never export. حتى لو حلفوا لك على أيمانات الله على كل حاجة. It's a rational decision. you have a set of policies that are basically protective. I mean, I produce a car and I make a lot of money simply because the import tariff is 100% or 40% or whatever it is. Why the hell would I want to export? Why would Morocco export but not Egypt cars? It's as simple as that. So you need to work really hard on a set of policies to make it attractive for Egyptian producers to sell abroad. Now, whether you have to have a competitive exchange rate to begin with, second, you have to reduce the tariff, three, you have to penetrate new markets and make all sorts of free trade agreements. There is a set of policies. Things don't happen by accident. They happen because of a deliberate, thoughtful set of policies that change the incentive structure facing business people such that they export rather than produce for the local market. Same thing applies to savings. Budget deficit. The biggest dissaver in this country has been for quite some time is the government. We have a consistently budget deficit, and yes, nowadays it's certainly much less than before. I was delighted that the Ministry of Finance was reporting a positive primary surplus, for instance. That's just the beginning of everything. If you have a primary surplus in the budget, that means at least you have a little money to service to cover the cost of your debt service. You are on the right track, and I hope that continues. But the government budget is a source of trouble. Now, coming to saving and investment, I agree with Alia that if we want to grow fast, we have to invest fast. And to invest, you either have to get money from outside, or you have to increase domestic savings. Domestic savings are very difficult to increase in any country. It takes time because savings is a function of income. I save when I have more money. I don't have more money because I'm poor and I don't know. So saving rates are largely, there are habits and social values and this and that. I mean, we can get into this, but that's too tricky. But generally speaking, I think the biggest source of saving or reducing this saving is the government, not the individuals. Because remember, you save, you put your money in the bank, and the government, Ahmed, goes and takes it in his own bag and spends it whichever way he likes. And that's problematic. Now, let me say one more thing, two more things. The issue of one of the things that I think we really have a problem in this country with is that growth means investment. That is just not true. There are two things. One, there is idle capacity everywhere. If you have any numbers, if I were you, I would ask the CAPMAS to give me the latest data on the idle capacity. How many factories are not working? How many factories are working one day and not the rest of the day? How many buildings? How many compounds we have in the north coast of Egypt that are used only 2 months a year? That is ridiculous. When you travel, this B&B, and you go and rent an apartment, and everybody is renting their apartment even for a week, and they make money, they get more money, and the economy is richer. We have a problem in this country. We always think of investment, but we don't think of the investment that we already made. Why are we not using it effectively and efficiently? That is one part of the story. Now, when it comes to the business environment, I don't know, there is a shorthand that most people use, and I just want to conclude with this one and give you one alternative idea. The government should sit with the private sector and listen to what they are saying and do it today or yesterday rather than today. That's a song I have heard so many times for so many years, and nothing happens. What did Morocco do to improve the business environment? I wrote that in one of the articles in Al-Masri Al-Yawm some time ago. And basically they created a unit that is in the business of ranking the constraints and announcing that this year they are going to reduce 5 of the most binding constraints. The survey is based on the views of all the private sectors, not those who are lucky to sit with the Prime Minister or somebody else. It's a systematic process. It is announced. They managed to improve their ranking in the Doing Business report from 120-something to 68 in a span of a few years. That is the way to go. Now, I am done with the part that you didn't ask me about, so let me come to your questions. Internationally, everybody, all forecasts are not very bright, unfortunately. Economic growth rates are likely to be slow. Inflation is already high. The migration and suffering and even cost of primary goods, fuel. So we are living, Egypt is living in a world that is not a very happy world, and it's not a world. But in economics, we do differentiate between the small country assumption, the large country assumption. Large countries can't change the formula. We are not a large country in that sense. We are a price taker. We should be in the business of managing our affairs the best possible way we can, given the circumstances. If we blame it on the other guys and do nothing, we are hurting ourselves. If we say that the world is not doing well, therefore, I can't help it. No, you can. Yes, we can, just like Barack Obama said.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. I think we have a couple of minutes to answer some questions that were raised by the floor. So I'll start with Mr. Ahmed and ask you, people are asking, what is the impact of Egypt's issued sovereign green bonds in 2020? And will we be seeing more of these debt instruments? And building on this, what is the expected date for the Panda bonds?
For the green bond, by the way, it was a very important milestone, and I think when we issued our, it was the first sovereign, by the way, green bond in the region. When we issued this bond at that time, of course it was a different environment. We were able to get the best rate ever in our history for a 5-year bond. It was below the 5%, and it was a very good rates at that time. It was the best ever rates. But more importantly, it was during this transaction, it was around $750 million of issuance. There were a couple of important observations. First of all, that we got for the first time 30 new investors, institutional investors that never came to Egypt under any names. Sometimes you have investors that have different funds and different names. No, those were purely new investors. Second, now looking back after almost 2 years of issuance, they are more sticky than other investors. Most of those investors are there until the maturity, and they don't sell. So even its performance now in the market is much better. And thirdly, it allowed also us to make the right benchmarking for the private sector. I mean, we were very proud to see CIB following, and others, even some private companies. And you have to have this benchmarking happening anyway. So I think it was a very good move. It allowed us, more importantly, to have a seat around the table, to know what's happening globally, to know what's the regulations, the rules, the laws. We now publish every year an impact report on those issuances. Unlike other regular issuances, we just borrow and then we pay. This we borrow and we pay, of course, but we also report and report and report. And that's a very important part of our future pricing. So it's very important. On the Panda bond, in general, we're trying to diversify as much as possible, and we're trying to go a bit east because there is a lot of liquidity in the east and a lot of untapped market there and untapped opportunities. So we're trying. Last year we did the first samurai bond ever in our history, which was guaranteed by the Japanese government. Now we're trying to go to the Chinese market for the first time. Those things are not only meant for the government, it's meant to open the markets also for the private sector so that they can tap this market. So the Panda bond, inshallah, before this fiscal year, we'll be able to issue it. And we're just waiting for the right moment, but we have most of the preparation is behind us now.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Alia, the question for you. Given that you were speaking about a private investor and what the government should do and sit and listen to the problems of investors, people are asking, how can we attract more investors and be an export hub in the region? And what should we focus on to mitigate the challenges faced by the private businesses today?
Well, we do have the Egyptian Federation of Industries. I think it should act, become more active, represent its members, not just talk, but represent fiercely its members, suggest certain policies with regards the facilitation of the production sector. I mean, if we start by improving the environment for the Egyptian investor, the foreign investor will come. We don't have to look at the foreign investor now at all. Just look at our Egyptian investors. As Dr. Ahmed said, how many companies are there that are working with underutilized capacities that are sometimes more than 50%? How many companies are there like that? Looking at the banking decision with the letter of credit, and so, which made importing the raw materials and the semi-finished goods and so on that are used in the production. A lot of industries are in standstill, waiting for foreign currency to be available. So the government has to look in the situation and see, first of all, who are the exporters here, to look into that, because we need foreign currency. So to make a list, the most exporting companies, they would be given first row. Second, those who are increasing their exports at a high rate, although they are not big investors, but they have the capacity to increase their exports at a high rate, also support them. I mean, there should be a criteria to provide the limited resources that are available in the financial sector, in the banking sector. There should be a criteria to provide the finance to these companies. And then once the machine is starting to work, returns will be coming, exports will be exported, and money, internationally, foreign currency will be coming in. It's a gradual process. It doesn't happen today. We start today, but it happens over time. It might take 6 months, it might take 9 months, but it will happen. But if we keep on waiting and I don't know, expecting solution to come from where exactly, if we keep on doing that, this will not solve our solution. We have to take drastic measures, whether fiscal, monetary, or trade policies, so that the economy starts to move again. Once our economy is moving, money will be coming in gradually. I'm not saying anything will happen this year. Maybe by the middle of next year, if the government is supporting the exporting companies, if it is supporting the tourism sector, whatever, all sectors that generate foreign currency should be given special attention. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our last question to Dr. Ahmed. So
an easy question, right?
Sorry?
An easy question.
An easy one. So people are asking, when are we going to get out of the foreign currency turmoil? So they're interested in the when more than the how.
That's such an easy question. That
one last part of it, how can we cope with the devaluation?
Sorry?
How can we cope with the devaluation?
Yeah, I mean, in Arabic we say لا يلدغ المؤمن من جحر مرتين. احنا مؤمنين ونلدغ 3 مرات. It's remarkable. If you compare the situation we were in a few months ago, before we make the deal with the IMF, the second deal or a third deal, I'm not sure. This is the third one, the third deal with the IMF. 2016, right before we make the deal, we had the same problems we had a few months ago. So we keep repeating the same mistake, and we think that we are going to win next time. Well, you're not. Because if you keep making the same mistakes, you're going to end up in the same hole. Typically, what happens is that we have a foreign exchange shortage. The central bank monetary policy decides that the best way to do it is, well, attack these Sayarfa guys. You know, they are the ones who are causing the problem. We send the police to close whatever and to capture the money they have. And no. Let's impose some control on what to import and what not to import. And then we have two parallel markets. People are complaining that they don't have the foreign exchange to import. Factories are closing or slowing down. And then we say, we have to float. We float it. I have never seen a pound or a currency that floats more than once. Once you float the currency, it's already floating. So how come the floating currency needs another floating? Why is it that we needed to float another time? Simply because we went back to the same practices that led us to the first floating. Why are you surprised that you needed to float another time? So basically monetary policy has to be, and I think I liked what I heard today from Mr. Hisham Az-Al-Arab, that now the exchange rate is not going to be the target. You cannot control everything. You're not God. Only God can control everything. But you and me can control one thing and not another. So basically, central bank, hopefully, going forward, would have learned the lesson and became a mu'min. And they are not going to try to control everything at the same time. Therefore, we are not going to have a problem next time. Let me, because the cost is high, it's too high. First of all, you mess up expectations. People don't know what the hell is going to happen tomorrow. But equally importantly, we have an imbalance between inflation and income. Basically, every time you float, what happens? You know, the government is kind enough to give some people some money, whether it's in the form of social protection or in the form of increasing little pensions by £300 or this or that. And then you get the guys who are rich, like my friend Ahmed Fikri Abdul Wahab, who doesn't mind, they can do whatever they like. But the guys in the middle are suffering because the trouble is the prices of everything is going up. Their income is not going anywhere. Therefore, you have a middle class that's really suffering and suffering huge. So there are very strong negative repercussions on economic justice, if you like, but more importantly on social stability for that matter. I mean, when people get totally fed up, what do you expect? Either that they resolve their problems peacefully, if there is a peaceful mechanism for resolving conflicts between citizens and governments, or they go to the streets. You don't want either. I mean, no, you want the first one. You don't want the second one. It is even more costly because we know that the economic consequences of people going to the streets in January 2011 have been justified but very high. You don't want to get to that stage. So basically, I'm not sure I answered your question or not, but I think the real solution lies fundamentally with monetary policy, and I really do hope that this time we are going to behave in a different way from before. And of course, the finance can help them a little bit by not leaning on them too much. And by the way, with finance, if there is one message that I want to convey to my friend Ahmed and His Excellency the Minister, I would say that what this country needs the most at this point in time on the fiscal side is what I would call unity of budget. We have a tendency in the last few years to create pockets in different places. What are these pockets? Why should Sunduq al-Siyadi have its own budget and separate? Why should Al-Hay'a Al-Umraniya have their own money and keep whatever money they make? What is this? You cannot have fiscal policies that are sound without enforcing the principle of unity of government budget. At least it will enable them to use what we fancily call in the economics counter-cyclical fiscal policy, meaning the economy is slowing down, they get active and they put some stimulus, and vice versa if the economy is slowing down. I want to stop here and I want to congratulate our friend Sharif Kamel on 75th birthday. Not you, the department. Thank you.